Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Mariana Almeida, and this is the McKinsey Talks directly from the McKinsey studio in São Paulo. Since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, the topics of well-being and mental health have become even more central in the lives of people and the routine of companies. In search of alternatives to relieve stress, many users have turned to platforms and apps that help them meditate, relax, or focus. Today, we talk about customer centricity and product leadership at Headspace, the largest and most successful platform for mental health. Our guest is Leslie Witt, Chief Product and Design Officer of Headspace Health, connected directly from the Silicon Valley. Hello, Leslie. It's a pleasure to have you here with us today.
Oh, thanks so much for inviting me.
Great. Welcome. This is the 5th episode of our Customer-centric Growth series, in which we talk to some of the world's most influential product leaders in different industries. The series is hosted by Fabrício Duor, partner at McKinsey and leader of product design and customer experience in Latin America. Welcome, Fabrício. It's such a pleasure to have you here again with us.
Likewise. It's great to be here. And I think especially today with Leslie, former colleague from IDEO, leading product and design in a product that I actually use myself. So it's a pleasure to see that as well. And I think all in all, also to shed some light into world-class product-led organizations, and as the topic grows, and it becomes more important.
Great. So let's get started.
Let's get started. So to get going, Leslie, it is a question we're asking all our interviewees, which is, what's your favorite product right now?
Great question. I'm going to give you two. I'm going to cheat just a little bit. But my favorite digital product right now is shared by many around the world, which is Wordle. My entire family jumped on the Wordle bus and is obsessed with its habit formation, virality, sharing capabilities, accessibility. And I think for me, when I look at what are the attributes of a high quality, particularly digital product, the fact that it's intuitive, that it's inclusive, that it's effective, and that it's delightful are the attributes that I always judge my own work through. And Wordle, which is, just this simple blank 5x6 grid with 2 color codes and the ability to share, it really hits all those marks. And you see that in the fact that my entire crew, who span the age from 84 to 10, are hooked. So Wordle's my top digital product of the moment. And I would also say that the joy of copycatism is one of those ways that you can understand if your product is successful. And it has spawned just an entire industry of dulls, the Wordles, the Quordles, the Cocktortles, and more to come. But if I actually think what is my most durable favorite product, I'm an obsessive compulsive gardener, and my favorite product is the Haas copper watering can. It's decades, if not over 100 years old. The design hasn't changed. It's beautiful. It's sustainable, and it reminds me permanently that I have this great honor and responsibility to get to care for the plants.
Very cool, very cool. And there's something fascinating about simple products, right? And how they can multiply into different ways of usage and all that. So that's a great example. And I think also to, continuing, and just want to understand a little bit more about your background. What was your career, where, what the places you've been through and that led you into the role you are now?
How much time do we have? No, I'm kidding. I think of my career in chapters, and I'd say I'm on chapter 4. But I started my career with 10 years spent as an architect, both acquiring my degrees and practicing as an architect, only, to hit this moment. Are you also an architect by training?
No, I'm an architect by passion. I will be an architect.
And so am I still, but I have to say I'm glad I'm not one by profession. And what I discovered was that my passion for architecture and the academic practice of architecting, which is very expansive in nature, just was not met at all, particularly in the US, by the actual practice of being an architect. And while I still have incredible respect for the profession and those that practice it. It turned out that 10 years in, I realized it was really not for me. And I had this like crisis of conscience and of future because I'd been on this narrow, like very specific professional path. And I hit my late 20s and realized I wanted off. And thankfully, it was like right at that moment, this was 2005, that I'd met my husband. We were moving out to the West Coast. And he said, well, you know what? I think you'd actually love this place called IDEO. And because I'd been so narrow focused on architecture, IDEO was completely off my radar. And I think my first response back to him was like they must be awful architects. I've never even heard of them. And he was like, they're not architects. It's a design firm. And it's actually a kind of famous design firm. And thankfully, through, I'd say like good part serendipity and very light part strategy, I ended up 2 months later joining IDEO in their burgeoning smart space practice. So kind of taking my architecture skills and applying them in the expanded field. And that next almost 10 years, I was at IDEO for over 9 years. I really describe as like being reoxygenated. All the things that I thought were possible and true from an academic perch and from a passion for architecture and the kind of cultural relevance it holds, strategic, systemic, actually ended up coming true in terms of the application of design thinking, that combination of deep human understanding meets experimentation, creativity, and the rigor of evolution. And, it was at a time where IDEO was being asked to answer more and more questions. And some of the questions that kept appealing to me were those in the financial space, really looking at how do we evolve money services to better meet people's needs and actually drive positive outcomes. And so I got to a point at IDEO where I felt like I was no longer learning as much as I could, and that I could have more positive impact stepping into the corporate environment. And so I jumped to my next chapter. We're on chapter 3 here for those following along at home. And I joined the fintech company Intuit to lead all of the development of products and services within their small business and self-employed space. And for me, this was just an incredible expansion of really understanding how to connect innovation strategy to business goals and business outcomes. I ended up leading a lot of our entrepreneurship efforts and also learning like where organic growth comes to play, where inorganic growth comes in, and how to drive that connection between business strategy, business outcomes, and product evolution, which really led me to where I am now, which is, courtesy of COVID, I came out of the social momentum of work, kind of came like many of us right into my very living room and stared at myself all day on the screen and realized that much like my chapter close at IDEO, I felt like my learning had started to stall out. And that while the financial space still has, many problems yet to be solved, that my contribution to that space was largely done, and that there were other problems that felt more pressing for me to kind of apply that lens of customer understanding meets technical and product and design acumen, and to drive change in those spaces. So picked amongst a very small few, kind of democracy and civil society, education, and mental health, and just realized that where I wanted to write my next chapter was in the mental health space.
Great. So speaking of mental health, can you tell us a little bit about Headspace and your role there?
Yeah, absolutely. So Headspace is now Headspace Health. And that reflects the merger that we engaged in last fall, bringing the strength of historic Headspace, which is really a meditation and mindfulness platform. And I'll talk a little bit later, kind of in depth about that, with the telecoaching, teletherapy, and telepsychiatry capabilities of Ginger. And what that allows us to be is really the most comprehensive and accessible mental health and wellness platform that's available. In terms of my role, I'm the Chief Product and Design Officer. And that means that I have the privilege of overseeing like a really motley crew of folks whose unifier is that they're all oriented towards translating customer need and understanding into our core product experiences, our content experiences, and our human services in order to drive incredible outcomes. So product managers, product designers, a really robust brand and creative team, a whole crew of content folks who really bring to life all of our multimedia, both on and off platform content. And last but not least, a science team. And this is, people with backgrounds in behavioral psychology, clinical psychology, and a lot of the kind of evaluative research that helps us understand how to drive healthy habit formation, as well as to continuously improve the efficacy of our products and services.
Yeah, I wanna follow up on this, on the organizational perspective, and the breadth of the role of leading product and design. And I want to talk, of two things. One, product and design, and how these things play together, and how, what's the role of design within product. So this is one point. And also to understand what are all those capabilities that you mentioned, like science, data, is all within product, and how they interact with each other.
That's a meaty question. I'll start, and then feel free to interrupt me. First of all, I come to being a chief product officer vis-a-vis being a chief design officer. Mm-hmm. And so the dimension of design, which I think really has that translational capability of harnessing empathy and insight and making it into something real and touchable and palpable, is a very unique skill set, both deep craft as well as deep analysis, and always very premised on kind of a research core. I hold that to be of incredible relevance. And as I've shared with you in the past, have always advocated successfully that design have an equal seat at the table and not be a function that reports into product or into engineering, as it is in a wide variety of other organizations. I have also always advocated that it is the seat of product innovation. And so have had historically responsibility for that kind of horizon level exploration that can lead into, an organic growth funnel, but also directly into corporate strategy and M&A activities. That had me having a pretty strong foothold, an interpretation of the design charter that, smells like product, right? That starts to talk in a very visceral way around prioritization, around expense and commercial commits. And so as the aperture expanded in terms of the relevance of a growth strategy to our connected product strategy, it was a very natural evolution to take direct product ownership, both of kind of run the business product as well as growth levers. And
which
I do
means
think that
also commercial responsibility, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And so, I think from that lens, what I try to do is ensure that my staff is a microcosm of the very same kind of equal footing table, both in terms of level as well as in influence, where we're able to really hear the perspectives of the science leader, of the design leader, and of the product managers, all at the same level footing, so that there's shared understanding as well as shared decision making.
Mm-hmm. And I think so something that I'm noticing a lot in the market and within my clients is that there is, there's a group of companies that are, looking into how technology companies have done that and figured that out, right, through the role of the chief product officer, in different contexts, right, and having more connection with design and all that, but having this function, right, of the CPO. Whereas there's a lot of companies that are struggling with how to put together the organization, right? And I think that's what I was asking you about the commercial responsibility, because what I see a lot is this mix-up of, no, maybe I will leave the commercial responsibility in a business unit, and I will create a chief product officer function, which in the end of the day, it becomes incomplete, right? Because you don't have the visibility and the growth perspective and the commercial perspective within the same person.
Well, and I think it, and so I don't also want to overstate the case. I think that when it comes to actually who's accountable to deliver X metric, the reality is that in a lot of cases, particularly as it comes to commercial commits, there's shared responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
And so when it comes to our commercial product, I look very much at kind of the, like, once you show up at any one of our channel doorsteps, like, how is my team driving that overall conversion, engagement,
Perfect.
retention,
Yep.
right? And so those have very, very real commercial outcomes to them.
Absolutely.
And, I'd say auxiliarily from a product-led perspective, how are we fueling growth through sharing, through virality, through gifting, right? Like, what are the enablers that we have more control over that can actually help drive business outcomes? But when it comes to, we have a multi-channel company.
Absolutely.
When it comes to our enterprise business, to our health payer business, that's, the making and securing of those relationships is very much on the sales team and the go-to-market teams. When it comes to our brand spend and our performance marketing distribution, that's very much on the marketing teams. And so I think having a C-staff who fundamentally sees themselves as collaboratively responsible for outcomes is essential, because the product leader cannot do it alone unless we're talking about a very small company. But then again, none of those other leaders can either.
And one question to follow up on this: does Headspace use product-led growth approaches as well, or is it more focused on, let's say, marketing-driven commercial distribution?
Yeah, it's really a hybrid. So I'd say, like, our most effective product-led growth so far has come through our off-platform content partnerships. And so, just about a year and a half ago, my team partnered with Netflix to bring 3 series to life on Netflix. And that kind of product and content-led growth has been one of our most effective drivers of all time in driving awareness and interest to actually then sign up for the core product. We're currently working on a number of features that are, in a more tactical and mechanical way, product-led growth, meaning the ability to share, to engage in community-based spread, but have always really relied on a brand and content-based pull and awareness to actually drive visitorship to the product and then, kind of fuel the same thing on and off again.
Yeah, that makes total sense. One thing that I wanted to discuss with you is the role of a CPO, right? And as I was saying, I see a lot of companies looking into having, a chief product officer because it's a way of becoming more customer-centric. We've heard through these conversations also other examples of the CPO being that person that funnels the energy and funnels the initiatives towards the customer, right? And kind of to deliver something which, having the product as the most important aspect, right, of what the company does, which makes a lot of sense, right? And obviously because of that, we see, and I actually was looking at the numbers for it, there's a growth of 40% in the title of Chief Product Officer, from last year to this year. So it's actually, a growing, there's a trend in having a CPO. What is the role of the CPO? Like, what it entails in your perspective?
I mean, I see it in a few buckets, and in a way they track a life cycle of development. One is to set a compelling vision for the company that helps outline where we're going, kind of orient the troops towards that level of capability and possibility, and plants the seeds of durable advantage within the core crew. The next is to really focus on prioritization, which is amongst the range of things that we might be able to do that would deliver on that promise. What are the ones we're going to prioritize now and why? And to help drive, kind of the processes and alignment that's necessarily to deliver. And then the third one is really about always assessing efficacy, which is how did we do? What attributes of quality were delivered, what attributes of customer promise were delivered, and how do we siphon that back in to a continuous improvement lens, as well as something that both applies and tests our strategy.
And do you think this function has matured in the market and organizations? Why?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's in a growth phase, right? As Fabrizio was talking about, the expansion of the title is substantial. And with that, I think there's a fair amount of flexibility in the term. I would point out that that's true as well within a lot of the more historic crews, right? You have wild divergences within what a chief people officer is responsible for. You have pretty broad swath difference in terms of what a chief marketing officer is, even though those are far more long-standing roles. And I think with the chief people officer, with the chief product officer, it's going to be incredibly responsive to the nature of the business. It might bend more operational in some, it might be more in a company that's reached its maturity about kind of marshaling of resources and incremental improvement in another. And, while, in the tech idiom, it more likely smells like an innovation role that's more tightly partnered with corporate strategy.
Yeah, I think it's part of how the market is maturing, right? And how the function is maturing as well. Because I think it's also fairly new, right? To have a CPO, I think it's probably, obviously, this usually starts in the West Coast in the US, and then it spreads to different parts of the world. But I think it's also about the maturity of the function kind of, going a long time.
Yeah, and I will say this, which is I think it can be a vanity role. And same thing I would say if you were talking about the role of chief design officer, which is a company might desire a values-based transition to being, both more innovation-friendly as well as more customer-centric, and can look at hey, look, we hired a chief product officer, so check mark done, versus seeing that is really planting a signal flag to the organization and to the world that you have an intent to change, and that equipping that person with decision-making capabilities and with the investment needed is critical to ensuring that doesn't just end up being, more of a kind of puppet role versus something that actually drives true impact.
Which I think goes back to what we're talking about before, which is, what are the responsibilities of that function, right? Because if the responsibility, and this is what I see a lot, and maybe I think you capture it in a perfect way, having it like a vanity role, it doesn't add a lot. It actually creates a lot of frustration in companies because that person wouldn't be able to have, for example, to make business decisions, right? Or decisions that will actually influence massively the business. Because at the end of the day, obviously, if you have the product leadership, you're going to have some sort of impact because you're direct contact with the customer. But what I see in a lot of forward-thinking organizations is actually bringing business units within product and having the kind of the accountability through activation, engagement, other business growth metrics, right, within that role.
Totally. And the only thing I'd add there, Fabricio, is I think a lot of times organizations are attempting to shift from being sales-led to being product-led.
Yep.
And it's a really hard transition, right? And it doesn't suddenly mean that the sales organization isn't important, if they don't bring incredible both competitive insights as well as customer and client insights to the table. But it by nature means that they are not setting the roadmap, right? And that transition of saying our priorities are not established, particularly in a business that's more enterprise oriented, by the next client's requirements, but that we actually have a durable strategy that has its own trajectory, and you are selling that. And that the product itself has inherent growth levers within it, or will, and that will create deeper sustainability for all of us. And it requires, habit change as well as aligned beliefs.
Yeah, I can even take that to another level, which I'm seeing a lot, which is this shifting mindset from a sales-led mindset to a product-led mindset. You actually change, you tend to become much more customer-centric. And also, you tend to pay much more attention to the product itself. Because I think a lot of times when you have kind of very sales-minded, right, types of organizations, it tends to have that mindset of taking notes of features or specs from directly, and not thinking through what does it mean in the larger context of things, what's a roadmap, and having the type of intentionality, right, of where you're going. But also this less customer-centric really view, right, of what are you doing, right, what's and putting the product underneath, right, and kind of putting down the product and focusing too much on like, let's just put all the effort in, cost of acquisition. Let's put a lot of money in like acquiring customers and not thinking through like what's the quality of the product. That's why I was asking about the product-led growth, because it's such a natural movement if you have a great product, right? Because people are going to talk to other people.
Totally. Well, and I think that, to give fair due to sales-led organizations, there's a dimension of customer centrism, right? Like understanding your client's desires and needs and being able to meet to that. I think that some of the inherent differences, though, are that product customer centrism really focuses more on a job to be done. What's the why behind why they purchased? And how do I ensure that I am delivering on that why so that they want to stay with me? It has just that longer duration cycle. So they want to advocate for me and share that they actually recommend this to others. And that some of the rationale as to why you're seeing this shift more broadly is that business model, particularly in tech, tends to look more like I have to care because my cost of acquisition is so high that if I can't actually add to longer lifetime value, if I can't retain you, engage you, then I'm not actually going to fulfill the core promise of this product. And so, a transactional business model makes a ton of sense to have more of a sales or marketing-led organization. But as it becomes more about engagement or retention, that's just simply an unsustainable way to acquire and deliver.
And I think before jumping, I want to go back into the organization and talent conversation, but just to complement what you're saying, a lot of, in different industries, a lot of what we're seeing is that it is becoming software as a service, right? It is becoming like banking is becoming software as a service. Retail is becoming software as a service, and there's a lot of shift, right? Into become it's in that logic of the CPO, of the product leadership, of the product-led growth. It makes so much sense, right? Because it's so similar to a technology, driven type companies.
Totally.
But I want to talk about the organization and talent a little bit because you mentioned that I got really curious about it. I've seen different situations in product organizations, right? And most of the time, the product leader has the product organization, as a responsibility. And also there's kind of dotted lines of technology engineers, for example, that participate in the product that kind of reports to the CTO. But you mentioned, scientists, data scientists, other profiles. Where do they sit in the organization? Do they sit all within product? Do they connect in the squads? Is it Scrum-based, the work, or is it not? Like, just, give a little bit more flavor, please, on the organizational side.
Yeah, and I think there's no universal answer, period. And, I'm a big believer in the maxim of structure follows strategy, and that with that, you'll never achieve the ultimate ideal because the ideal is always going to need to ramp and shift depending on what it is you're actually trying to achieve. Now, that said, I would say for our own journey, one of the reasons that the science team actually sits in my team is that we realized that having it separate from product really led us to an underutilization of those capabilities across that continuum that I was talking about in terms of product responsibility, from strategy to prioritization to evaluative. And that we were harnessing the power of the science team purely from an evaluative capacity, and then in a more kind of relationship driven versus responsibility driven way as expert consultants. So we were under leveraging each other, and that bringing the team into the fold ensured that structural collaboration was built in to how we work. And then we have mapped, particularly the behavioral scientists, directly into our squad structure. I'm going to use this as just a little minute to give my stump speech, which is, we're in a transition right now with how we work hand in hand with our data science team, which for us reports through our technology organization. I think makes a lot of sense because we have a deep reliance on building out the data engineering capabilities to empower the data science kind of ML and AI algorithmic moves. But what I've seen at past companies, and we're certainly in our own transition, is that team has placed a high premium on their own autonomy. And I actually don't believe, even in very large organizations, in the role of autonomy as a sustainable way to drive change. Because what it ends up usually doing, and I'd say it certainly is in our case, is that there's a lot of underleveraged, really interesting experiments, but that are disconnected enough from core strategy that they aren't going to be prioritized to scale within the kind of regular running roadmap. And it leads to mutual frustration, right? There's this sense of like, well, you all aren't harnessing the power of what we're potentially bringing to life, which is true. And then a frustration from the product side of you're working on something that is actually not what I am prioritized, which is also true. And so I think the exchange that happens organizationally is giving up a little of the flexibility of an imagined autonomy in order to actually have outsized impact.
So there's also this role of orchestrating all that, right? And kind of giving a direction to that. And the second part of this is talent, people. Like, where do you find, from my perspective and what I see in the market, I think not only here, but I think in other places, is just really hard to find great people, right? It's just, especially you're talking about technology, about design, data science. What do you hire for? And how do you, retain talent?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say hiring, retaining, and growing great talent is the number one job of the senior leadership organization. To craft a brand and a culture and a process and structured environment where that's possible is like the number one job above and beyond the kind of business results and strategy. Because without it, there is no sustainable path forward. And I think people are feeling that very viscerally in the world of right now. We have a huge benefit, which is that we have a highly known and desirable brand that is working on a problem that the world now sees and cares a lot about, in particular, younger people, those kind of new college grads just coming out of bachelor's programs, master's programs. It's on their radar as something that they would like to make part of their life's mission. And so we don't have a pipeline challenge. Like when I post a role, it's sometimes almost the opposite. And I think this makes me think back to the heyday years of IDEO, where people like everyone applies. I'll post a role and 1,300 applicants. And so in some ways, the challenge is more about how do you, with a lens towards diversity, equity, inclusion, actually like look through those applications in any way that gives fair shot at your evaluation criteria and brings the right candidates into the hopper. So, we are quite lucky in that way. But then, that certainly isn't job done. And so making sure that you're able, and this is harder in a remote world, to put the culture that you've crafted on display for the candidate, to mutually figure out if the role and the place, and I mean place in, the kind of little p version, are a good fit. And if you have the capacity from a direct leadership perspective, but also from an organizational growth perspective, to foster that person's growth internally.
Great. And going back to the product, I would like to know the role that Headspace played in people's lives during the pandemic. And was it an opportunity to improve the product?
Totally. We saw, as did others in the mental health and well-being space, just a massive surge of need and interest. And, some of that, we ended up making our product free, I think, second week of the pandemic to anyone who was unemployed. We'd always been free to educators. And, we're trying to expand both the social impact as well as awareness role. And, we saw a very heavy uptick. We also saw the same in terms of employer interest in including, a mental well-being tool as part of their offering to their employees. So massive growth from the enterprise channels. But I think the more interesting part of what we saw during the pandemic was that people were coming to us, like a large number, with like a very vague sense that we could help. They weren't heavily acquainted with meditation. They'd heard of it. They weren't necessarily looking to develop a practice. what they were looking for was to feel better, right? They were in acute states of need with just uncontrollable stress, very high levels of anxiety, acute levels of depression. And what we realized was that we more or less had an ethical responsibility to expand our services, that, the very real health benefits that can be delivered by having a meditation practice, that can be delivered through learning the tools of breathing, were inadequate to meet those needs. And that what we were seeing was that more or less people were asking us to be this front door to care, which is how we really think of our service now, where we can use that inviting brand, that destigmatized access to content, the kind of preventive infrastructure to then help assess how you're doing. And if you're in a need where you need to, be connected to therapeutic services, to psychiatric services, that we provide that on-ramp to do so, quickly and with ease.
I imagine that, I'm thinking about how organizations changed like through this period of time. And also how, people started to pay more attention, companies pay more attention to mental health, like through the pandemic, right?
Yep.
And we know, and we discussed a little bit about that, like, adolescents, for example, it's a major crisis going on. I think I just want to, because I think that has a connection with the product, but also kind of from a larger perspective. What are you seeing as the kind of challenges moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. First of all, I would say that the pandemic shone a light on a crisis that was already here. Mm-hmm. So when you look at a lot of the stats that are jaw-dropping, around like 30% of adults experiencing in the US like clinical levels of anxiety and depression, those ramped during COVID, but those stats are pre-COVID stats. Mm-hmm. And same thing, when you look at the ramp in adolescent suicidality and adolescent, kind of mental health disorders, that ramp was on the uptick. And COVID, yes, was an accelerant, but I think positively what it did was it took something that wasn't in the public discourse and squarely made it part of the public discourse, particularly if you're thinking about like HR communities and employers looking at their broader responsibility to take care of their employee populations. And so, we did, as I mentioned, like we saw a really substantial uptick in terms of enterprise interest in mental health services and mental well-being services during the pandemic. I think we do have some indicators. We run a very comprehensive annual survey, and the results really just came in, I think, 2 weeks ago from our most recent one, which is that employees still put mental health services as like consistently one of their top 2 desires and needs. What we're seeing is some decrease in terms of enterprise focus. And I think that's a mistake. And I don't say that as the chief product officer of a company. I say that as someone looking at the broader landscape of needs, which is this mental health crisis does not go away as the pandemic situation lessens. One, there's going to be a long tail of trauma, both for those who directly lost folks and just out of the situational norms and the isolation that were the pandemic. And what it has permanently surfaced is that as a society, we have to treat mental health as health and levy the right level of attention and services toward it.
Thanks. Unfortunately, we are reaching down the end of our session, so you have time for one quick question.
One quick question. Headspace is an incredible product. It's growing a lot. I think it's also it's very, very useful, and as we all discuss here, it's very to the core of human beings. And you have an amazing multidisciplinary product organization. So I think I just want to get your advice for other product leaders or companies that are going through that transition to build their product organization that have a CPO just as a recent new function. What do you recommend to those companies? Like where to start, or maybe some tip?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one I gave previously, which is hiring a CPO is not a job done. It's the start of the journey. I think tops down support is essential, and what that means is creating a reality where that person is an empowered decision maker, and funding those teams with the right groups, whether that's a restructuring and a movement of other disciplines that exist into the group, or it might even be the recognition that roles like, say, user research or evaluative research don't yet exist, and allowing that person will need both the monetary support, but also like the spiritual support of the organization to actually drive the efficacy which you'd like them to.
Super. Couldn't agree. Can't agree more. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Leslie, and thank you very much, Fabrício, both of you, for being here with us, talking about this fascinating
thank you so much for inviting me. It was a great way to spend a morning, and I hope that I was able to share a few nuggets that are relevant to your listeners.
A lot. Thank you very much, Leslie.
Yeah, it was great. Fantastic. Thank you very much. The Customer-centric Growth series will be published as a McKinsey Talks video and podcast on YouTube and Spotify, but also as short articles on mckinsey.com.br. If you would like to know more about product-led organizations, send an email to mckinsey-talks@mckinsey.com. I would also like to thank all of you who are watching us on video or listening to us on podcast. Go to mckinseytalks.com for a full agenda on McKinsey Talks. There you can also check out this episode and earlier ones on video or podcast. That's it. Thank you very much and see you next time.